The Consensus Wars by John Kitchen. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. This is a work of cyber fiction that was created in an iterative process using multimodal large language models. Any resemblance to any person, place, or institution, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Epilogue. The new synthesis. 5 years later, Elena stood before an auditorium at Georgetown University, looking out at an audience that would have been impossible to imagine when she started this journey. The front rows held atmospheric physicists and social psychologists, but behind them sat journalists and ethicists, tech executives and community organizers, former conspiracy theorists and current fact checkers. The banner above the stage read, "Information Integrity in Democratic Societies, the Georgetown Consensus." When we started this work 8 years ago, Elena began, we thought the problem was simple. Good science wasn't reaching the public effectively. We thought the solution was equally simple. Make scientific information more persuasive. She clicked to her first slide, showing the network visualization that had started everything. Beliefs spreading through social connections, like viruses through populations. What we discovered is that information ecosystems are complex, adaptive systems. They evolve, they adapt, they develop immune responses to intervention. Most importantly, they can't be controlled, only influenced. And even then, often in ways we don't expect or intend. Elena had spent the 3 years since the congressional hearings rebuilding not just her career, but the entire field she'd helped create. The Consensus Foundation had been dissolved, its techniques made public through mandatory transparency requirements, and its former staff scattered across academia, government, and civil society organizations. But the work hadn't stopped. If anything, it had accelerated. "Dr. Vasquez," called a voice from the audience. She recognized Dr. Park, a political scientist from Yale. "Given what we now know about the weaponization of belief engineering techniques, do you think this research should have been pursued at all?" Elena had wrestled with that question daily. The techniques they'd pioneered were now used by everyone from pharmaceutical companies to foreign intelligence agencies, from environmental activists to oil industry lobbyists. Every month brought news of more sophisticated information operations targeting democratic discourse. "I think the question isn't whether we should have developed these techniques," Elena replied. "I think the question is whether we could have avoided developing them. Information warfare predates social media by centuries. What's new is the scale and sophistication, and those were going to emerge whether we participated or not." She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of information manipulation campaigns from the tobacco industry's cancer denial efforts in the 1950s to contemporary climate disinformation operations. The choice wasn't between a world with information manipulation and a world without it. The choice was between understanding these systems scientifically or leaving them to be understood and exploited by others. Dr. Sarah Kim, now director of the Institute for Democratic Information at Stanford, stood up from the third row. "What about the consent issue? The communities we studied never agreed to be subjects in our experiments." It was the question Elena had expected. Sarah had become one of the field's most thoughtful critics, arguing for strict ethical frameworks around what she now called social cognitive interventions. "You're right, that informed consent as traditionally understood is impossible when you're studying network effects at population scales," Elena said. But I'd argue that we need new models of democratic consent for interventions that affect information ecosystems. She clicked to a slide showing the Arlington Consensus Model, a framework developed by an interdisciplinary team for conducting large-scale information interventions with community oversight and democratic accountability. In Arlington, Virginia, we've been running a 3-year pilot where community representatives review and approve all information intervention research before it begins. Residents can opt out of network mapping. They receive regular reports on ongoing studies, and they vote annually on whether to continue participating. The Arlington model had become a template for what Elena's team now called democratic epistemology, the systematic improvement of information ecosystems through community-controlled research and intervention. Alex Petrov, speaking from a video link from Helsinki, where he now ran the EU's Information Integrity Research Program, appeared on screen. Elena, can you talk about the cascade effects we're seeing from the democratic consent models? Elena nodded. 12 cities are now operating versions of the Arlington model. What we're finding is that communities with democratic oversight of their information ecosystems show higher resilience to both misinformation and manipulation attempts. When people understand how information flows work, they become harder to deceive. The findings had surprised everyone. Rather than making populations more vulnerable to manipulation, transparency about belief engineering techniques seemed to inoculate communities against them. People who understood how their opinions were being influenced became more thoughtful consumers of information. Which brings us to the larger question. Elena continued, clicking to her final slide. The image showed a network diagram, but instead of anonymous nodes, it showed actual community institutions, schools, libraries, local newspapers, community centers, connected by pathways of trust and information exchange. We can't uninvent the science of belief change. These techniques exist, they're being used, and they're getting more sophisticated every year. The question is whether democratic societies can develop the institutional infrastructure to govern them responsibly. Dr. Maya Okafor, now head of Health Information Integrity at the CDC, raised her hand. What does that infrastructure look like practically? Elena had been working on this question with teams across government, academia, and civil society. Information intervention review boards at the federal level, similar to IRBs but designed for population-scale research, community consent frameworks for local studies, transparency requirements for all organizations conducting information operations, and most importantly, public education about how these systems work. She thought about the high school curricula now being piloted in 6 states, information ecology courses that taught teenagers how beliefs spread through social networks, how to identify manipulation attempts, and how to trace the sources of information they encountered online. The goal isn't to eliminate influence, Elena continued. The goal is to make influence more transparent, more accountable, and more democratic. A hand went up in the back. Elena recognized Marcus Webb from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, though he looked older and more careworn than when they'd last met. Dr. Vasquez, what about commercial applications? Should corporations be prohibited from using these techniques for marketing purposes? Elena paused, remembering her discomfort with the pharmaceutical contracts that had helped fund the foundation's expansion. I think the question is disclosure and consent, she said. If a pharmaceutical company wants to use network analysis to identify trusted voices in patient communities, they should be required to disclose that they're doing so, fund independent research on potential harms, and provide communities with the tools to evaluate their interventions. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it represented the compromise that democratic societies seem to be reaching. Sophisticated information techniques could be used commercially, but not in secret, and not without accountability. The session continued for another hour, with detailed discussions of regulatory frameworks, research ethics, and international coordination on information integrity standards. As Elena fielded questions, she found herself thinking about the warehouse in Oakland where this had all started. Sarah sketching network diagrams on whiteboards, Alex building belief propagation models, Maya tracking ideas like epidemiological outbreaks. They'd been trying to save science from political attack. Instead, they'd helped accelerate the development of tools that were reshaping how democratic societies processed information about everything. After the formal session ended, Elena found herself in conversations with attendees who represented the new infrastructure emerging around information integrity. Journalists who specialized in covering influence operations, tech executives building platforms designed to resist manipulation, former conspiracy theorists who now helped communities recognize and counter misinformation campaigns. Dr. Thompson appeared at Elena's elbow, moving slowly with the aid of a walker, but still radiating the intellectual intensity Elena remembered from graduate school. "Margaret," Elena said, genuinely pleased to see her former mentor. "Thank you for coming." Thompson smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Elena had seen from her in nearly a decade. "I wanted to see what you'd built from the ashes of your old work." They found a quiet corner away from the networking conversations. Thompson settled carefully into a chair, studying Elena with eyes that were still sharp despite her age. "I owe you an apology," Thompson said. Elena blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For thinking that maintaining scientific purity was more important than adapting to new realities. You were right that traditional academic approaches weren't sufficient for the challenges we were facing. I was right that abandoning ethical constraints was dangerous, but the solution wasn't choosing one approach over the other." Elena looked around the auditorium, where conversations were happening that would have been impossible 8 years earlier. Climate scientists and social psychologists comparing notes on countering misinformation. Tech executives and ethicists designing platforms for democratic information processing. Former enemies collaborating on shared problems. "The synthesis," Elena said. "The synthesis," Thompson agreed. "Rigorous science, but applied to urgent social problems. Effective intervention techniques, but governed by democratic institutions. Innovation, but with accountability." Elena thought about her current position as director of the National Institute for Information Integrity, a new federal agency tasked with coordinating research on belief networks, misinformation, and social cognitive interventions. Half her staff were former academics like herself, trained in rigorous research methods. The other half were former practitioners from consulting firms, advocacy organizations, and even recovered conspiracy theorists who understood how influence operations worked in practice. "Do you think it's working?" Elena asked. Thompson considered the question seriously. "Ask me in 10 years, but I'll say this. Vaccination rates are stabilizing, climate change denial is measurably decreasing, and communities seem more resilient to foreign information operations. Those are outcomes, not just intentions. Elena nodded, though she knew the victories were fragile and incomplete. Anti-vaccine networks had adapted to transparency requirements by developing more sophisticated counter-transparency strategies. Climate disinformation had evolved beyond simple denial to more subtle forms of delay and deflection. Foreign interference operations were becoming more culturally sophisticated and harder to detect. The information wars weren't ending. They were professionalizing. But so were the defenses. The Georgetown Consensus represented something unprecedented, a systematic effort by democratic societies to understand and govern the tools of belief, change that previous generations had left largely unexamined. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Phoenix follow-up study results are in. Communities that participated in the democratic consent pilot show 40% higher resistance to manipulation attempts compared to control communities. The inoculation effect is real, and it's lasting. Elena showed the message to Thompson, who read it with evident satisfaction. "You may have actually done it," Thompson said. "You may have figured out how to make democracy more resilient instead of more vulnerable to manipulation." "We'll see," Elena replied. "But for the first time in 8 years, I'm optimistic." As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself standing once again in front of the network visualization that had started everything. The diagram looked different now. Instead of anonymous nodes connected by invisible pathways, she saw communities of real people making conscious choices about how to process information, how to evaluate sources, and how to maintain democratic discourse in an age of sophisticated influence operations. The consensus wars had begun with a simple goal: helping scientific information compete more effectively against misinformation. They were ending with a more complex understanding. Information ecosystems were like any other complex system. They could be studied, influenced, and improved, but never controlled. The goal wasn't to eliminate bad information, but to build communities that were resilient to it. Elena looked out the auditorium windows at the Georgetown campus, where students were walking between classes, checking their phones, processing the constant stream of information that would shape their beliefs about science, politics, and the future of their society. Those students would inherit information ecosystems that were more transparent, more accountable, and more democratically governed than previous generations had experienced. They would also inherit more sophisticated manipulation techniques deployed by actors with resources and motivations that Elena was still learning to understand. The question wasn't whether they would win the consensus wars. The question was whether they would fight them with tools that strengthened democracy instead of weakening it. Elena gathered her materials and headed for the exit, where Sarah was waiting with a rental car for their drive to Reagan Airport. "Good conference?" Sarah asked as they navigated DC traffic. "Productive conference," Elena replied. "I think we might actually know what we're doing now." Sarah laughed. "Only took us 8 years of mistakes to figure it out." Elena watched the Potomac River pass by, outside the car window, thinking about complex systems and unintended consequences, about the difference between influence and manipulation, between persuasion and coercion. Somewhere in the water, molecules flowing past, there were probably atmospheric particles that had been part of the hurricane systems she'd studied a decade earlier. As a climate scientist, everything was connected. Every intervention had consequences, The goal wasn't to eliminate those connections, but to understand them well enough to make the consequences more democratic, more transparent, and more aligned with the kind of society they wanted to build. "What's next?" Sarah asked. Elena checked her phone, reviewing the schedule of meetings that would consume the next week. Congressional briefings on foreign information operations, strategy sessions with social media platforms on manipulation detection, collaboration planning with international partners on coordinated response systems. The work was harder now, more complex, more ethically fraught. It was also more important than anything Elena had done as a traditional climate scientist. "Next," she said, "we figure out how to scale this up without screwing it up." "Think we can do it?" Elena looked out at the Virginia suburbs rolling past, at communities full of people trying to make sense of an increasingly complex world with information tools that were barely keeping pace with the sophistication of those trying to deceive them. "Ask me in 10 years," she said, echoing Thompson's response. But for the first time since standing in that conference room 8 years earlier, listening to communications experts offer solutions that weren't solutions, Elena thought the answer might actually be yes. The consensus wars weren't over. They might never be over, but they were being fought with better weapons, by combatants who understood what they were fighting for, governed by rules that made victory compatible with democracy itself. It wasn't the ending Elena had imagined when she'd started this journey, but it was an ending she could live with. And in an age of information warfare, that felt like victory enough.